There are lakes that seem older than the hills that surround them. Their waters rest so quietly that the smallest ripple feels like the memory of a forgotten visitor, lingering for just a moment before fading back into stillness. Long before castles crowned distant ridges, before banners fluttered above stone walls, and before the names of kings were carried from village to village, these silent waters were already watching. The lake remembers. It remembers footsteps softened by moss, cloaks dampened by morning mist, and voices lowered almost to whispers as travelers reached the shoreline. Some arrived with hope, others carried sorrow. A few sought wisdom, while many simply stood in silence, unable to explain why they had felt drawn to this peaceful place where the water reflected both the heavens above and the mysteries below. The surface appears calm, almost impossibly smooth, yet beneath it lies another world, hidden from hurried eyes and restless minds. Ancient stories tell of halls more beautiful than any built by human hands, of gardens untouched by winter, and of a lady whose presence seemed as timeless as the water itself. She appeared only when the moment was right, as though the lake itself had chosen to give shape to its oldest memories. Generations have come searching for her, each believing they might finally understand who she truly was. They returned home carrying stories that sounded familiar, yet never quite the same. One storyteller spoke of a queen draped in shimmering robes. Another remembered a wise enchantress. A third described a guardian whose quiet strength shaped the fate of kings, while others insisted she was something far older than any queen or sorceress, a spirit whose home had always been the deep places where fresh water meets ancient stone. The lake remembers them all. For countless centuries, people have paused beside quiet waters and imagined that someone might be watching from beneath the mirrored surface. Perhaps it is the gentle movement of reeds in the evening breeze. Perhaps it is the way mist gathers so effortlessly across still water, hiding the opposite shore until the familiar world seems to disappear. Or perhaps certain places have always invited stories, preserving them as carefully as the lake preserves every reflection that settles upon it. Welcome to the Sleepy Legends channel, where we gently explore the myths, folklore, history, and legends that have comforted curious minds for generations. If you enjoy peaceful journeys through the world's oldest stories, I invite you to subscribe. And if you would like to share where you are listening from tonight, your comment helps build a wonderful gathering of listeners from around the world who find quiet companionship in these timeless tales. Let us return to the water. The morning mist has begun to lift just enough to reveal the shoreline, where smooth stones disappear beneath crystal clear shallows. Tall grasses sway with unhurried grace, and somewhere in the distance a lone bird calls before falling silent once again. The lake waits without impatience, content to reveal only what it chooses, never hurried by those standing at its edge. Among all the legends carried across medieval Britain and France, few figures remain as mysterious as the Lady of the Lake. She appears at moments when the story itself seems ready to change. A child finds a protector. A young king receives the sword that will define his reign. An old wizard entrusts his greatest secrets to a gifted student. A weary kingdom watches as its greatest treasure disappears beneath quiet water, returning to the place from which it first emerged. Yet these moments do not always belong to the same woman. As the centuries passed, poets, monks, storytellers, and wandering musicians each added another layer to the legend. Some gave her a name, others gave her several. Some imagined a graceful fairy queen whose beauty rivaled moonlight on still water. Others described a wise guardian whose magic was rooted not in dazzling displays, but in patience, knowledge, and the quiet certainty that every season arrives in its own time. The more these stories spread, the more varied they became. Rather than replacing one another, they settled together like leaves drifting across the same lake, each floating peacefully beside the next. One tale would remember her kindness, another would remember her power. Still another would remember only the mysterious hand rising from the water, holding a gleaming sword before vanishing once more beneath the surface. Perhaps every storyteller truly believed they had found the real lady of the lake. Perhaps they had. There are legends that ask us to choose one version above all others, deciding which account should be trusted and which should quietly fade away. The Lady of the Lake has never belonged to that kind of story. She slips gently beyond certainty, appearing wherever imagination, memory, and history meet. Like water itself, she refuses to remain in a single shape for very long. This quiet mystery may be the greatest reason her story has endured. Nearly 1,500 years have passed since the earliest whispers of Arthur's world began to echo across Britain, yet listeners continue returning to the lakeshore. They come not because every detail agrees, but because every telling offers another reflection upon the water, another glimpse of someone both familiar and impossible to fully know. The lake remembers every one of those reflections. Tonight, we will walk slowly along its shores, following the stories left behind by generations of dreamers, scholars, poets, and pilgrims. Some paths will lead toward ancient Celtic traditions that honored sacred springs and peaceful lakes. Others will carry us into the great medieval romances, where knights sought honor, queens protected kingdoms, and enchantresses quietly shaped the destinies of heroes without ever seeking crowns for themselves. As each story unfolds, another gentle ripple will spread across the water, joining those that came before it. By the end of our journey, we may discover that the Lady of the Lake has never been a single person waiting to be identified. Instead, she has always been something much more enduring, a timeless reflection shimmering just beneath the surface, inviting every generation to see something a little different in the quiet waters that remember us all. The oldest stories rarely remain unchanged. Unlike books resting quietly upon a shelf, legends travel from one storyteller to another. They cross mountains, rivers, and generations, gathering new details wherever they are welcomed. A tale whispered beside a Welsh fire might someday be told in a French castle, returning years later with familiar echoes and entirely new names. The lake remembers every storyteller. No one intended to change the legend. Each simply told it in a way that felt true to the people listening nearby. Like sunlight reflected across moving water, the story shifted without ever losing its heart. Perhaps that is why the Lady of the Lake has so many names. Some knew her as Nimue. Others called her Vivian, Ninian, Nynaeve, or simply the Lady of the Lake. Rather than imagining these as different women, it may be gentler to think of them as different reflections upon the same quiet water. Every generation recognized something familiar, even while describing her in its own way. The lake remembers every name. It keeps them all without asking us to choose between them. The medieval writers who recorded Arthur's legends inherited centuries of living tradition. They were not inventing a single story so much as gathering many older ones together. Ancient Celtic beliefs, fairy lore, sacred springs, hidden islands, and mysterious women slowly blended into the figure we know today. Perhaps she was never meant to be completely understood. Some legends become richer because they leave room for mystery. The lady belongs to those stories. She appears when she is needed. She teaches. She protects. Then she slips quietly back into the mist before anyone can ask too many questions. The lake remembers. Soon, a traveler will approach its shore. His name is Merlin. The lake remembers the years before Arthur. Long before the famous sword flashed beneath the morning sun, before knights gathered around the round table, and before wandering minstrels carried tales of Camelot across Britain and France, the water watched kingdoms rise and quietly fade away. Rulers came believing their reigns would last forever. Seasons continued their patient rhythm, and the lake remained exactly where it had always been, reflecting the changing skies without judgment or haste. History often unfolds so gradually that those living through it scarcely notice the turning of an age. One generation grows old while another is still learning to walk. Small disagreements become lasting rivalries. Ancient alliances weaken. New families rise to prominence while older names slowly disappear from memory. Looking backward, these changes appear inevitable. Living through them, they would have felt like ordinary days unfolding one after another. The lake remembers every ordinary day. It remembers shepherds guiding their flocks along quiet hillsides, fishermen launching simple boats into the morning mist, and travelers stopping only long enough to drink from cool springs before continuing toward distant villages. None of them could have imagined that future generations would remember this landscape as the birthplace of one of the world's greatest legends. In those early years, Britain was a land of many small kingdoms. Some were prosperous for a season. Others struggled against neighboring rulers who hoped to claim fertile valleys, important rivers, or ancient strongholds perched upon rugged hills. Roads were uncertain. Borders shifted. Peace rarely lasted for very long. Yet beyond the ambitions of kings, the forests continued to grow. Rivers continued to flow toward the sea, and the quiet lakes remained untouched by human quarrels. The lake remembers all who came to its shores. Some sought solitude after long journeys. Others carried prayers too private to speak aloud. A few arrived searching for wisdom, believing that places untouched by the noise of courts and armies might offer answers that could not be found anywhere else. Among those who wandered Britain's ancient landscapes, one figure would become more closely associated with mystery than any other: Merlin. Even his beginnings seem to belong halfway between history and legend. Medieval writers could never entirely agree about who he was or where his remarkable gifts first appeared. Some portrayed him as a prophet whose understanding reached beyond ordinary sight. Others described him as a gifted counselor whose wisdom seemed almost impossible to explain. Still others surrounded his birth with miracles and mysteries that placed him somewhere between the human world and the enchanted one. Like the Lady of the Lake herself, Merlin became many things to many storytellers. No single version ever replaced the others. Instead, they settled together across the centuries, each preserving another reflection of a remarkable man whose understanding reached farther than most people believed possible. The lake remembers his footsteps. Whether you walk beside this very shoreline or another hidden water known only to the oldest stories hardly matters. Legends have always allowed extraordinary people to find one another, even when geography becomes less important than meaning. Somewhere, beneath quiet branches and drifting mist, the paths of Merlin and the mysterious lady would one day cross, changing both of their lives in ways neither could yet foresee. For now, however, that meeting still belongs to the future. The water remains still. The morning mist hangs gently above the surface. The oldest stories continue gathering, waiting patiently for the moment when destiny begins to move, almost as quietly as the first ripple spreading across an ancient lake. For all his mystery, Merlin was never remembered simply as a magician. The oldest traditions surrounding him speak first of wisdom. Kings sought his counsel because he seemed able to see beyond the urgency of the present moment. While others worried about the next battle or the next harvest, Merlin watched the slow turning of years, understanding that the choices made today would echo long after those making them had become part of memory themselves. The lake remembers those who learn to wait. It remembers that the deepest waters are seldom stirred by passing winds. Wisdom often moves in much the same way, quietly gathering over many years until it seems as natural as the landscape itself. Those who hurried rarely noticed it. Those willing to linger beside still waters sometimes caught the faintest glimpse. Stories soon gathered around Merlin's remarkable insight. Some claimed he could foresee the future with astonishing clarity. Others believed he understood the hidden patterns woven throughout nature, reading the flight of birds, the changing skies, or the quiet rhythms of the seasons with uncommon perception. Whether these gifts were magical, deeply intuitive, or simply the result of extraordinary observation depended upon the storyteller, yet every tradition agreed that Merlin possessed knowledge unlike that of ordinary men. He became an advisor during one of Britain's most uncertain ages. The kingdom longed for stability, though stability remained frustratingly out of reach. Alliances shifted with surprising speed. Promises were made, then broken. Noble families struggled for influence, believing that if only the right ruler could be found, peace might finally take root across the land. Among the rulers who sought Merlin's guidance was Uther Pendragon. History and legend blend together almost seamlessly during this period, making it difficult to separate one from the other. Medieval chroniclers often cared less about recording precise events than preserving the deeper truths they believed those events revealed. Their goal was not merely to list kings and battles, but to explain how a troubled kingdom gradually prepared for the arrival of its greatest ruler. The lake remembers preparation. Great stories rarely begin with the hero. They begin with the world that quietly awaits the hero's arrival. That waiting filled the years before Arthur's birth. Britain was becoming a place where old traditions and new ambitions stood side by side, each shaping the future in ways no one could fully understand. Ancient sacred landscapes remained woven into everyday life. Even as fortified towns grew larger and powerful rulers sought to unite lands that had long remained divided. Merlin seemed to understand both worlds equally well. He could stand within a royal court, offering practical counsel to kings, yet he was equally at home beneath towering oaks or beside peaceful lakes where silence carried its own kind of wisdom. In many ways, he embodied the meeting of two traditions, one rooted in ancient Celtic understanding of the natural world, the other moving steadily toward the great chivalric legends that medieval writers would later celebrate. Perhaps that is why the Lady of the Lake and Merlin feel so naturally connected. Both belong to the threshold between worlds. Neither fits comfortably within ordinary history. Both seem to arrive precisely when the story itself requires guidance rather than force. The lake remembers unseen meetings. Not every important conversation takes place inside a castle. Some unfold beneath whispering branches where sunlight dances across quiet water. Others occur beside hidden springs known only to a handful of travelers. Medieval storytellers delighted in these places because they suggested that true wisdom often lived beyond crowded halls, waiting instead within landscapes that encouraged patience and reflection. As the Arthurian legends continued to grow, many writers imagined that Merlin frequently withdrew from the noise of kingdoms. He sought places where the natural world spoke more clearly than the ambitions of princes. There, surrounded by forests, streams, and peaceful waters, he reflected upon the future taking shape before him. These quiet retreats became an important part of his legend, reminding listeners that insight often emerges not from constant activity, but from moments of stillness. The lake remembers those moments. One day, during one of these quiet seasons, Merlin would encounter a remarkable young woman whose curiosity matched his own love of knowledge. Their meeting would become one of the most fascinating relationships in all of Arthurian literature. It has been told with tenderness, admiration, caution, and tragedy, depending upon the storyteller. Yet every version begins with two extraordinary minds drawn together by a shared understanding that some mysteries are worth a lifetime of study. Before we meet her, however, it is worth lingering just a little longer beside the water. The Lady of the Lake does not rush into her own story. Like the lake itself, she allows those who seek her to arrive in their own time. There is something wonderfully patient about the oldest legends. Modern stories often hurry toward their most memorable characters, introducing them as quickly as possible before carrying the audience from one dramatic moment to the next. The Arthurian legends move differently. They linger beside quiet streams, pause beneath ancient trees, and allow the landscape itself to become part of the story before anyone speaks a single word. The lake remembers that patience. Perhaps that is why the Lady of the Lake is almost never introduced with a grand entrance. She does not arrive accompanied by fanfare or proclamation. She simply seems to be present, as though she has always belonged to the quiet places where water meets stone, waiting without impatience for the moment when someone finally notices her. Many medieval writers describe her as possessing remarkable beauty, yet they rarely dwell upon it for very long. Instead, they speak of composure. She carries herself with the calm assurance of someone who has little need to prove her importance. Kings may command armies. Knights may win great victories. Wizards may astonish those around them with extraordinary knowledge. The lady rarely competes with any of them. She simply acts when the moment calls for wisdom. And then, just as quietly, she disappears once more. The lake remembers quiet strength. It is easy to overlook because it asks for no applause. Like water slowly shaping solid stone, its influence becomes visible only after many years have passed. Looking back across the Arthurian legends, we begin to notice that some of the greatest turning points arrive not through battles, but through the gentle decisions of a mysterious woman who seldom seeks recognition for herself. This may be one reason her character has remained so compelling. She is never driven by ambition in the ordinary sense. She does not seek a throne. She does not gather followers. She does not ride across Britain in search of glory. Her power rests in discernment, in recognizing the right moment, the right person, and the quiet choice that will alter history more profoundly than force ever could. The lake remembers those choices. Perhaps this is why so many storytellers found themselves returning to her generation after generation. They recognize that the loudest figures are not always the ones who shape the future. Sometimes history turns because one thoughtful person quietly opens a door that no one else realized was waiting to be found. As different authors expanded the Arthurian world, they imagined the lady in many different ways. Some pictured her dwelling within a magnificent palace hidden beneath enchanted waters, where light shimmered through crystal halls and every season remained gentle and green. Others imagined an island surrounded by mist, so carefully concealed that only those invited could ever hope to reach its shores. Still others left her home almost entirely undescribed, allowing listeners to imagine for themselves what might lie beneath the perfectly still surface of an ancient lake. Each version offers a different reflection. The lake remembers them all. What remains remarkably consistent is the feeling these places inspire. Time seems softer there. The worries carried from the outside world become strangely distant. Forests appear older. Birds sing without interruption. The air itself feels quieter, as though every sound has been gently wrapped in morning mist. It is a landscape where wisdom seems entirely at home, and where the boundary between history and legend becomes almost impossible to notice. It is here, in one of these timeless places, that the paths of Merlin and the lady begin to draw closer together. Neither is searching for fame. Neither is seeking conquest. Both are drawn toward knowledge, toward the patient unfolding of mysteries that cannot be hurried. Their meeting has been imagined in many different ways over the centuries, yet every version carries the sense that two remarkable minds have recognized something familiar in one another. Soon, the quiet waters that have watched kingdoms rise and fall will witness another beginning. The lake remembers, and it is about to introduce two of the most unforgettable figures in all of Arthurian legend. The lake remembers their first meeting. No manuscript tells the story in quite the same way. Some place it beside a secluded spring hidden deep within an ancient forest. Others imagine a quiet lake wrapped in drifting mist, where sunlight filtered through towering branches and every sound seemed softened by the stillness of the water. A few leave the setting almost entirely to the imagination, offering only the comforting certainty that such a meeting could only happen in a place where the ordinary world had begun to fade. Perhaps that uncertainty is exactly as it should be. The first meeting between Merlin and the lady belongs to that rare kind of legend that grows more beautiful, because it cannot be confined to a single telling. Each storyteller approaches the quiet shore, pauses for a moment, and then invites us to imagine the scene through different eyes. The details may change. The deeper truth remains remarkably constant. The lake remembers two seekers. Merlin had spent much of his life gathering knowledge wherever it could be found. Wisdom, to him, was never something to be possessed. It was something to be pursued with humility, patience, and quiet wonder. Every forest held another lesson. Every season revealed another pattern. Every conversation offered the possibility of seeing the world from a slightly different perspective. The young woman who would become known as the Lady of the Lake shared that same restless curiosity. Whether she is called Nimue, Vivian, or another of her many names, nearly every tradition agrees that she possessed an extraordinary desire to learn. She was not satisfied with simple explanations or familiar customs. Like Merlin himself, she wished to understand why the world worked as it did, how hidden forces shaped visible events, and why certain places seemed touched by mysteries older than memory. The lake remembers curious minds. Perhaps curiosity is one of the gentlest forms of courage. It asks us to step beyond certainty, to admit that there are still wonders waiting to be discovered. Every great scholar, every gifted craftsperson, every careful observer begins in much the same way, by looking a little longer than everyone else, by asking one more question, or by quietly listening after others have already decided the conversation has ended. It is easy to imagine Merlin recognizing that quality almost immediately. The legends often describe him as possessing remarkable insight into human nature. Long before someone spoke, he understood something of their character. Long before events unfolded, he sensed where certain choices might lead. If that is true, then perhaps he also recognized a mind capable of carrying knowledge forward into another generation. The lake remembers teachers. The finest teachers are rarely interested in displaying how much they know. Instead, they delight in discovering someone whose enthusiasm makes every lesson feel like a shared journey. Knowledge grows larger when it is shared. Wisdom deepens when two thoughtful people explore an idea together, each noticing details the other might have overlooked. So it was, according to many medieval romances, that Merlin began sharing his understanding with the remarkable young woman beside the water. He spoke of the movements of the heavens and the quiet rhythm of the seasons. He explained the hidden properties of plants gathered from woodland clearings and riverbanks. He taught the ancient words that storytellers associated with enchantment, though in these old legends, magic often resembles profound understanding rather than sudden spectacle. To know the true nature of a place, a plant, or a person was itself considered a kind of enchantment. The lady listened carefully. She remembered everything. Like the lake itself, she seemed capable of holding each lesson without disturbing its quiet surface, allowing every new understanding to settle naturally beside those that had come before. The lake remembers every lesson. Day after day, season after season, teacher and student walk beneath ancient trees, following woodland paths that wound toward hidden waters. Their conversations became part of the landscape itself, carried by bird song, reflected in peaceful pools, and whispered through leaves stirred by gentle breezes. Neither of them could know that future generations would remember these quiet conversations more vividly than the triumphs of many kings. Sometimes the most important moments in history happen not upon battlefields, but beside still water, where two people simply take the time to listen, to learn, and to understand. The lake remembers long conversations. Some may have lasted only an afternoon. Others, according to the legends, stretched across many seasons as teacher and student returned again and again to the quiet places where the outside world seemed pleasantly distant. Time has a curious way of slowing beside peaceful water, and the old storytellers often suggest that knowledge itself prefers an unhurried pace. Merlin was said to possess an understanding gathered over many years. He knew the histories of kingdoms, the old traditions that had survived countless generations, and the hidden meanings woven into stories that most listeners accepted without a second thought. He understood the movement of stars across the night sky, the changing character of the seasons, and the subtle language of forests where every living thing seemed connected to everything around it. The lady listened with uncommon attention. She did not seek knowledge simply to possess it. She wanted to understand it. There is an important difference between collecting facts and discovering wisdom. Facts may fill a library, yet wisdom asks how those ideas fit together, how they shape our understanding of the world, and how they might be used with kindness and restraint. The medieval writers often suggest that this deeper understanding was what distinguished the lady from those who sought power for its own sake. The lake remembers thoughtful silence. Not every lesson required words. Some truths revealed themselves only after long moments spent watching sunlight drift across the water or listening to wind moving gently through the branches overhead. A patient teacher knows when to speak. An equally patient student knows when quiet observation offers the richest lesson of all. Perhaps this is one reason their story continues to feel so timeless. Many of us can remember someone who quietly changed the course of our own lives. A teacher who noticed an ability we had not yet recognized within ourselves. A mentor who shared experience without asking for recognition. A trusted friend who listened with genuine care and encouraged us to see the world from a broader perspective. Those relationships often remain with us for a lifetime. The lake remembers every mentor. It remembers that true guidance is never forced. Like water finding its way through the landscape, the finest teachers simply create the conditions in which understanding can naturally grow. They offer encouragement rather than commands, and they trust that genuine curiosity will continue long after the lesson itself has ended. As the years passed, the lady became more than a student. She became a keeper of knowledge in her own right. Many later traditions describe her as possessing remarkable wisdom, not because she repeated Merlin's teachings exactly as she had received them, but because she had made them entirely her own. Every lesson had settled within her like clear water filling a quiet pool, becoming part of her character rather than merely part of her memory. The medieval romances often portray this transformation with remarkable subtlety. There is no single dramatic moment when the student suddenly surpasses the teacher. Instead, wisdom accumulates gently, almost invisibly. One conversation leads to another. One season gives way to the next. Looking back, neither person can easily identify the moment when the balance between them quietly began to change. The lake remembers gentle change. It rarely announces itself. A shoreline shaped by water appears much the same from one day to the next. Only after many years does anyone notice how completely the landscape has been transformed. Human understanding often grows in exactly the same way, so gradually that we recognize its depth only when we pause to reflect upon the path already traveled. Some storytellers suggest that Merlin understood this long before anyone else. He recognized that the remarkable young woman walking beside him was becoming one of the wisest figures of her generation. Rather than fearing that change, he continued to share what he knew, trusting that knowledge preserved by another thoughtful mind would endure far longer than knowledge kept to oneself. The lake remembers generosity. It remembers those who understood that wisdom becomes stronger when it is shared, and that every generation depends upon those willing to pass their understanding forward. Yet even the quietest waters eventually reflect gathering clouds. Among the many versions of this legend, there comes a moment when admiration becomes more complicated, when affection and trust begin to intertwine with destiny in ways that neither Merlin nor the lady can fully control. The next chapter has been told in many different forms for nearly 1,000 years, and perhaps more than any other part of her story, it reveals why the Lady of the Lake has remained one of Arthurian legend's most fascinating and deeply human figures. The lake remembers every version of what happened next. Few episodes in Arthurian legend have inspired more discussion than the story of Merlin and the lady. Medieval writers preserved the broad outlines of their relationship, yet the details shifted from one generation to the next. Each retelling reflected the values of its own time, offering listeners another quiet ripple upon the water rather than a final answer. In some romances, the affection between them grew naturally over the passing years. Teacher and student had become trusted companions, united by their love of learning and by countless hours spent exploring the mysteries of the natural world. Their conversations had wandered from the movement of stars to the quiet wisdom found in forests, from the histories of forgotten kingdoms to the hidden meanings carried within the oldest legends. It would not have seemed unusual for deep admiration to blossom into something warmer. Other storytellers remembered the relationship quite differently. In their versions, the lady admired Merlin's knowledge, but remained cautious of the influence he possessed. She accepted his lessons while carefully guarding her own independence, determined that her growing wisdom would never become overshadowed by another person's reputation, no matter how remarkable that person might be. The lake remembers both stories. Perhaps each reveals something meaningful about the generations that preserved them. Legends often tell us as much about the storytellers as they do about the characters themselves. Every age emphasizes different virtues. One century celebrates loyalty above all else. Another admires courage. Still another values independence, believing that wisdom should always be accompanied by the freedom to choose one's own path. The Lady of the Lake quietly became a reflection of those changing ideals. She is never simply carried along by the story. She shapes it. Whether she appears as a devoted companion, a gifted student, a wise enchantress, or an independent guardian. She remains someone whose choices influence the fate of nearly every major figure in Arthurian legend. Her strength lies not in commanding armies, but in understanding the quiet power of thoughtful decisions. The lake remembers thoughtful decisions. Like stones dropped gently into still water, they send ripples far beyond the place where they first began. The person making the choice may never witness every consequence, yet the circles continue widening long after the water has become calm once again. Among the many gifts Merlin shared was an understanding of enchantments intended not to harm, but to protect. Modern imagination often pictures magic as flashes of light or dramatic displays of impossible power. Medieval writers frequently imagined it quite differently. Enchantment could create a place of safety, conceal a peaceful valley from those who wished it harm, or preserve knowledge until the proper moment arrived for it to be discovered. The lady listened carefully to these lessons. She understood not only how such enchantments were woven, but also why they should be used with restraint. Wisdom, Merlin often suggested, required balance. Great knowledge carried great responsibility, and the finest guardians were those who acted only after careful reflection. The lake remembers restraint. Its greatest depth is hidden beneath a perfectly tranquil surface. There is no need for constant movement to reveal quiet strength. As the years unfolded, the lady came to understand every lesson Merlin was willing to teach. Some traditions gently suggest that there were moments when she saw possibilities even he had overlooked. Others simply say that she had become his equal, capable of preserving the ancient wisdom he feared might someday be forgotten. Then the stories begin to separate once more. Some describe sorrow, others describe necessity, still others describe an act of profound compassion. Rather than choosing one version above all the others, perhaps it is enough simply to acknowledge that every storyteller sensed the same turning point approaching. Their paths, which had run together for so long, were about to divide. The lake remembers farewells. Not every farewell is spoken with sadness. Some carry gratitude. Some carry acceptance. Some are simply the quiet recognition that every teacher hopes one day to see the student continue the journey alone. Soon we will arrive at one of the most memorable moments in all of Arthurian tradition, when Merlin's long story gently fades from the center of the legend, and the Lady of the Lake steps fully into her own. Like the still waters that have watched over every chapter of this tale, she remains calm, thoughtful, and quietly prepared for the extraordinary role that destiny is about to place in her hands. The lake remembers kingdoms without direction. There are moments in history when an entire land seems to pause between one chapter and the next. Familiar leaders are gone. Old certainties begin to fade. The future has not yet revealed its shape, and ordinary people continue their daily lives, wondering whether peace will ever become more than a hopeful wish carried from one season to another. So it was in Britain after the passing of Uther Pendragon. The stories tell of noble families uncertain whom they should follow. Great lords looked toward one another with cautious respect, yet beneath that courtesy lay quiet ambition. Every ruler believed they possessed the wisdom needed to guide the kingdom. Every ally wondered which friendships would endure if a new king should finally emerge. The lake remembers uncertainty. It has reflected many troubled skies. Clouds gather. Storms pass. The water remains. Merlin watched these events unfold with the patience that had always distinguished him. He understood that kingdoms cannot be held together by strength alone. A ruler may command an army, yet still fail to inspire loyalty. Another may possess neither wealth nor fame, yet quietly earn the trust of everyone around them through character alone. The old legend suggests that Britain needed more than another powerful king. It needed a rightful one. That simple idea echoes throughout the Arthurian tradition. The question was never merely who could seize a throne. The deeper question was who deserved to sit upon it, and by what measure such worthiness could ever be recognized. The lake remembers worthy hearts. They are often overlooked at first. Like smooth stones resting beneath clear water, they reveal themselves only to those willing to look carefully. Many listeners know the familiar story of the sword drawn from the stone. It has become one of the most recognizable moments in all of medieval legend, and with good reason. The image is unforgettable. A young man known to almost no one accomplishes what the greatest knights cannot. Yet that famous moment marks only the beginning of Arthur's journey. Another sword still waits beneath quiet water. Another gift remains patiently hidden. The lake remembers gifts that arrive at exactly the right time. Throughout the oldest traditions, extraordinary objects rarely belong to those who seek power for its own sake. Instead, they come to those prepared to carry responsibility. The object itself matters less than the character of the person entrusted to receive it. This pattern appears again and again throughout mythology. Sacred treasures choose their guardians. Ancient wisdom is revealed only when the student is ready. Quiet places reveal themselves only to respectful travelers. The Lady of the Lake belongs naturally within this timeless pattern. She is not merely the keeper of a remarkable sword. She is the guardian of discernment. She knows when the moment has arrived. As Arthur's story unfolds, she watches with remarkable patience. The young king begins gathering loyal companions. The kingdom slowly finds its balance. Hope, once scattered like autumn leaves across the countryside, gradually begins taking root again. The lake remembers hope returning. It does not rush. Like the first light of dawn spreading across still water, it arrives almost unnoticed, until suddenly the entire landscape has changed. Somewhere beyond the shoreline, hidden by drifting mist and centuries of legend, the lady waits. She has watched kings come and go. She has seen kingdoms rise, flourish, and fade into memory. She understands that even the greatest ruler cannot succeed alone. Soon, Arthur will come to the water. Soon, one of the most enduring images in all of folklore will rise quietly from the depths. The lake has remembered that moment for centuries. Now, at last, it is almost time for us to witness it together. The lake remembers the morning. No one can say with certainty what the sky looked like on the day Arthur first received the sword from the Lady of the Lake. Medieval writers rarely concern themselves with such details, yet it is difficult not to imagine the water resting in perfect stillness, disturbed only by gentle circles spreading across its surface, as though the lake itself had awakened in quiet anticipation. By this time, Arthur had already begun proving himself worthy of the crown. The young king possessed courage, yet courage alone had never been enough. He listened more than he spoke. He valued wise counsel. He inspired loyalty rather than demanding it. These qualities appear again and again throughout the oldest romances, quietly reminding us that true leadership is measured less by authority than by character. The lake remembers character. Crowns may tarnish, castles may crumble. A noble heart leaves a longer memory. Many traditions tell us that Arthur journeyed to the lake accompanied by Merlin. The old magician understood that another meeting had been quietly approaching for many years. The lady had watched Arthur's growth with patient attention, waiting until experience had begun to shape the young king into the ruler Britain truly needed. Great gifts are seldom offered too early. The shore lay peaceful before them. Morning mist drifted slowly above the water, softening the distant trees until they seemed almost part of another world. Every sound felt strangely gentle. Even the smallest ripple carried across the quiet surface with remarkable clarity, as though the entire landscape had become still enough to listen. The lake remembers silence before great moments. It asks nothing of those who approach. It simply waits. Arthur stood beside the water without knowing exactly what would happen next. Perhaps he sensed that this place was unlike any other he had visited. Certain landscapes seem to carry an atmosphere that cannot easily be explained. Voices grow quieter. Thoughts become clearer. Even those who arrive with busy minds often find themselves slowing their pace without realizing why. Then the water began to move. Not with violence, not with the crashing force of a storm. Only a series of gentle ripples widening across the mirrored surface until they reached the shore at Arthur's feet. From the center of the lake, an arm slowly rose above the water. The image has become so familiar that it is easy to forget how extraordinary it must have seemed to those who first heard the story. The hand emerged with complete calm, untouched by urgency or spectacle. It held a magnificent sword aloft as naturally as one might offer a treasured gift to a trusted friend. The lake remembers the sword. Its polished blade caught the morning light. Its jeweled hilt shimmered above the still water. Nothing else moved. Some storytellers tell us that the lady herself could be seen beneath the surface, her presence visible only for a moment before becoming part of the lake once again. Others describe her standing gracefully upon a small island, while a few simply allow the mysterious hand to speak for her, leaving listeners to imagine the unseen guardian below. Perhaps every version preserves part of the truth, for the lady herself has always remained more mysterious than the gift she bestows. Arthur accepted the sword with quiet reverence. He did not seize it. He received it. That distinction mattered deeply to medieval audiences. Excalibur was never presented as a prize won through conquest. It was entrusted to someone who had already demonstrated humility, wisdom, and restraint. The lady was not rewarding ambition. She was recognizing responsibility. The lake remembers worthy hands, not because they are the strongest, because they understand what strength is meant to protect. As Arthur closed his hand around the hilt, the legends tell us that the destiny of Britain quietly shifted once again. A king now carried not only a remarkable weapon, but a lasting reminder that his authority rested upon something deeper than force alone. The lady watched in silence. Then, as gently as she had appeared, she returned to the peaceful waters. The ripples widened. The reflections settled. Once again, the lake became perfectly still. The lake remembers gifts returned to the water. Long before poets told of Arthur and Excalibur, people living across Britain and Europe had already developed a remarkable custom. Objects of extraordinary beauty were sometimes placed into lakes, rivers, and quiet pools, not because they had been lost, but because they were being offered with great care. Swords, spearheads, shields, finely crafted ornaments, and objects of deep personal value disappeared beneath still water, entrusted to places that were believed to be worthy of receiving them. For centuries, these stories were known only through legend. Then, little by little, the earth began to give back its memories. Archaeologists uncovered ancient weapons resting in riverbeds and lakes, preserved beneath layers of mud where no ordinary accident could easily explain their presence. Many showed no sign of battle. Some had been crafted with extraordinary skill, only to be deliberately placed beneath the water soon after they were made. The lake remembers every offering. No written record explains every reason these gifts were made. Perhaps they marked moments of gratitude. Perhaps they honored unseen guardians. Perhaps they represented promises carried into waters believed to connect the human world with something older and far more mysterious. Whatever the reason, the custom endured for many centuries. When medieval audiences first heard the story of the lady presenting Excalibur, the image may have felt surprisingly familiar. They were listening to a new legend built upon memories that reached far deeper than Arthur himself. The shining sword rising from the lake echoed traditions already ancient by the time the first Arthurian romances were written. Perhaps that is one reason the scene feels so timeless. It carries the quiet weight of something remembered rather than invented. The lake remembers symbols. Water cleanses. Water nourishes. Water reflects. Water also keeps secrets. A sword resting beneath its surface is no longer a weapon of conquest. It becomes something transformed, removed from the ordinary struggles of human ambition, and placed into the care of a landscape that belongs to no single king. When the lady raises Excalibur from those quiet depths, she is not creating its importance. She is revealing it. The old storytellers understood symbolism with remarkable grace. They rarely paused to explain it. Instead, they trusted listeners to feel its meaning. A sword emerging from a peaceful lake suggests that true authority comes from harmony rather than violence. The greatest king receives his finest weapon not from a battlefield, but from stillness. Not through victory over an enemy, but through the quiet recognition of a guardian whose wisdom reaches beyond the concerns of any single generation. The lake remembers balance. Strength without wisdom becomes destruction. Wisdom without courage accomplishes little. The lady understands that both must exist together. This understanding quietly shapes everything she does. She appears only when needed. She gives only what should be given. She asks for almost nothing in return. Throughout the Arthurian legends, this pattern repeats again and again. Others pursue glory. Others seek power, fame, or a lasting remembrance. The lady seems content simply to ensure that the story continues along its proper course, intervening gently before once again allowing the waters to become still. Perhaps that is why she remains so difficult to define. She is not the hero. She is not the ruler. She is not the chronicler recording events for future generations. She is something quieter, a guardian, a witness, a keeper of sacred trust. The lake remembers every trust placed within its care. Soon another child will arrive at its shore, carrying grief far greater than any child should ever know. The lady will welcome him with the same calm wisdom she once offered Merlin and Arthur, and in doing so she will shape the future of the Round Table as surely as she shaped the destiny of Britain's greatest king. The water is waiting once more. Its oldest memories are not yet finished. The lake remembers children. Long before they become heroes, they are simply sons and daughters, learning to walk beneath familiar trees, listening to stories beside evening fires, and trusting that the adults around them understand how the world is meant to work. Few things are more difficult than watching that certainty quietly disappear. Among the many figures whose lives were forever changed by the Lady of the Lake, none may have known her kindness more deeply than Lancelot. His story begins not with triumph, but with loss. The kingdoms of Arthurian legend were seldom free from conflict. Noble families defended their lands, forged alliances, and sometimes found themselves drawn into wars they had never wished to fight. In one of these struggles, Lancelot's father, King Ban, saw his fortunes collapse as enemies closed steadily around his kingdom. The lake remembers endings. Even the strongest walls cannot stand forever. The greatest kingdoms eventually become memories carried forward by those who survived them. As Ban fled with his family, the legends tell us that grief overcame him. Looking back one final time toward the lands he could no longer protect, his strength failed, and he died with his kingdom disappearing into the distance. The image is one of the quietest moments in Arthurian literature, not a battlefield filled with noise, but a weary king whose heart could no longer bear the weight of all that had been lost. His queen, left alone with her young son, could scarcely pause to mourn. Every path seemed uncertain. Every decision carried impossible consequences. She had escaped one danger only to enter another, and the future stretched before her like an unfamiliar road disappearing into morning mist. The lake remembers those who grieve. It asks for no explanation. It simply offers stillness to those whose hearts have grown heavy. It is here that the lady appears once more, not as a guardian of kingship, not as the keeper of a sacred sword. This time she comes as a protector. The stories tell us that she approached with remarkable calm, offering reassurance rather than command. There was no urgency in her voice, no display of impossible power, only the quiet confidence of someone who had already foreseen that this child would one day play an important part in Britain's unfolding story. The grieving queen entrusted her son to the lady's care. Perhaps no act of faith could have required greater courage. To place a beloved child into another's keeping has always demanded extraordinary trust. Medieval audiences would have understood the depth of that decision immediately, for fosterage was an honored custom in many Celtic societies. Children were sometimes raised in another noble household, forming bonds that would last throughout their lives. The lady's care reflects that older tradition, though transformed into something even more wondrous. The lake remembers every promise. Some are spoken aloud, Others passed silently from one heart to another. Taking the child gently into her arms, the lady turned toward the peaceful water. The shoreline remained quiet. The morning mist drifted softly above the lake. Then, as so many storytellers have lovingly imagined, she and the child passed beyond the ordinary world, entering the hidden realm that had waited beneath the still waters all along. The lake opened not with noise, but with welcome. Its oldest memories were about to become the earliest memories of a little boy who would someday be known throughout the world as Lancelot. The lake remembers quiet childhoods. Many medieval romances tell us that the lady raised Lancelot within her hidden realm beneath the water. They describe it not as a place of darkness, but of remarkable beauty, where every season seemed gentle and every passing day unfolded with peaceful certainty. Like so much in Arthurian legend, each storyteller imagined the details a little differently. Yet together they create one of the most enchanting homes in medieval literature. Imagine entering that world for the very first time. The surface of the lake closes softly behind you, yet there is no feeling of sinking into cold depths. Instead, the stories speak of clear light, fresh air, and gardens that seem forever touched by spring. Streams wander through flowering meadows. Ancient trees spread their branches above quiet pathways. Crystal halls reflect the light with a gentle glow that never dazzles the eye. The lake remembers beauty without extravagance. Nothing needs to announce its importance. Everything simply belongs. Some writers imagine the lady's home as a magnificent palace hidden beyond ordinary sight. Others prefer to describe an island concealed by enchantment, where only those welcomed by its guardian could ever hope to arrive. Whether beneath the water or beyond the veil of the visible world, these descriptions share the same comforting atmosphere. They are places removed from haste, untouched by conflict, and protected from the ambitions that so often trouble kingdoms above. Perhaps they are reflections of Annwn itself. The old Celtic stories describe a land where peace and beauty endure without effort, where time seems to move according to its own gentle rhythm. Medieval romance transformed those ancient ideas into the lady's hidden sanctuary, preserving something of the older traditions while giving them a new place within Arthur's world. The lake remembers timeless places. Morning and evening lose their urgency there. The changing seasons become less important than the quiet joy of learning, growing, and simply being present within a peaceful landscape. It was in this remarkable place that Lancelot spent the years that shaped his character. He learned courtesy before combat, compassion before courage, patience before power. The order matters. The greatest knights were expected to master the sword, but the finest among them first learned kindness, humility, generosity, and self-control. These virtues were not separate from knighthood. They formed its very foundation. The lady understood this better than anyone. She did not raise a warrior. She raised a good man. The lake remembers gentle lessons. Some came while walking beneath flowering branches. Some while watching sunlight dance across still pools. Others arrived through quiet conversations shared over simple meals, where wisdom passed naturally from one generation to the next without ever feeling like instruction. Lancelot grew surrounded by beauty rather than fear. His earliest memories were not of battles or rivalries, but of calm waters, peaceful gardens, birdsong echoing through ancient trees, and a guardian whose quiet strength never demanded attention. Long before he became celebrated throughout Britain, he first learned that true greatness begins with the character formed when no one is watching. The lake remembers those unseen years. History often celebrates victories. Legends remember adventures. Yet the years spent becoming the person capable of such deeds are every bit as important, even when they pass in almost complete silence. Perhaps that is why the lady welcomed the child into her care. She understood that kingdoms are shaped not only by great rulers and famous battles, but also by the patient work of raising one thoughtful child, one season at a time. The lake remembers those who teach without seeking recognition. Some of the greatest lessons are never announced. They unfold quietly through daily life, becoming so natural that years later we scarcely remember when we first learned them. A child watches how kindness is offered. A young person notices patience during difficult moments. Courage, generosity, and humility are often absorbed long before they are ever spoken aloud. Perhaps this was the lady's greatest gift. She understood that character cannot be hurried. Like an oak growing from a small acorn, it develops one season at a time. Storms may strengthen it. Sunshine may encourage it. Time does most of the work. The lake remembers slow growth. Nothing lasting is ever rushed. As Lancelot grew older, the lady gradually introduced him to the responsibilities that would one day accompany his remarkable abilities. The romances tell us that he became skilled in riding, hunting, and the use of arms, yet these accomplishments arrived only after the quieter virtues had taken root. Skill without compassion was never enough. Strength without honor would have disappointed the teacher who had raised him. There is something deeply comforting about that order. Modern life often celebrates achievement first. The older legends quietly suggest that who we become matters far more than what we accomplish. Perhaps medieval audiences understood this instinctively. The finest knight was never judged solely by victories won in battle. He was expected to protect those unable to protect themselves, to remain faithful to his word, to show mercy when mercy was deserved, and to place the needs of others before his own ambition. These ideals were not always perfectly achieved, even within the legends themselves, yet they remain the standard toward which every knight was expected to strive. The lady had begun teaching those lessons years before Lancelot ever wore armor. The lake remembers preparation. A magnificent tree begins as a hidden seed. A master craftsperson begins as an attentive apprentice. A legendary knight begins as a child listening carefully to someone wiser than himself. When the time finally arrived for Lancelot to leave the hidden realm, the moment carried a quiet sadness that many parents and teachers would recognize. Every loving guardian understands that the purpose of raising a child is not to keep them close forever, but to prepare them for the day they must continue their journey on their own. The lady had always known that day would come. She had not sheltered Lancelot from the world. She had prepared him to enter it. The lake remembers every farewell. Some are marked with tears, others with smiles. The most meaningful often contain both. The romances tell us that the lady eventually brought the young man to Arthur's court, where his remarkable courtesy quiet confidence and extraordinary skill soon distinguished him from every other knight. Those who welcomed him saw a gifted young warrior. Very few understood where those gifts had truly been formed. Their source remained hidden beneath peaceful waters. The lady asked for no praise. She claimed no credit. She simply watched as the child she had protected became the man he was meant to become, content to remain once again at the edge of the story while others received the applause. The lake remembers quiet satisfaction. There is a special joy in seeing another person flourish, especially when the work that helped shape them remains almost entirely invisible. Gardens bloom because someone patiently tended them through many unseen seasons. Great cathedrals stand because countless skilled hands labored without expecting history to remember their names. The lady belongs among those quiet builders. Again and again throughout Arthurian legend, she prepares others for greatness, then gently steps back into the mist, allowing them to continue the journey while she waits beside the water for the next soul who may one day need her wisdom. The lake remembers. And before Arthur's story reaches its final chapter, it will call upon the lady one last time to fulfill the promise she made on that peaceful morning when Excalibur first rose from the depths. The lake remembers peaceful seasons. For a time, it seemed as though the hopes of Britain had finally found firm ground. Arthur's kingdom flourished. The Round Table became a symbol of justice, courage, and fellowship. Travelers carried stories of Camelot across Britain and beyond, describing a court where wisdom was valued alongside strength, and where the highest honor belonged not to those born into greatness, but to those who earned it through their actions. Like every beautiful season, it could not remain unchanged forever. Perhaps that is one of the quiet truths hidden within the Arthurian legends. Nothing in the natural world remains exactly the same. Spring gives way to summer. Summer slowly becomes autumn. Even the calmest lake reflects changing skies. The lake remembers every season. It welcomes each one without resistance. The legends tell us that the years passed peacefully for a long while. Knights departed on distant quests, returning with stories gathered from enchanted forests, forgotten chapels, lonely mountain passes, and quiet villages where kindness often proved more valuable than the sharpest sword. Around the Round Table, friendships deepened through shared adventures, while Arthur's reputation continued to grow throughout the kingdoms. Yet beneath every great story, time continues its patient work. Children become adults. Strong rulers become older. Even the happiest moments quietly become memories. The lake remembers passing years. Its waters remain. The faces reflected upon them slowly changed. Among those changing faces was Lancelot. The frightened child welcomed into the lady's hidden realm had become the greatest knight of his generation. His courtesy, humility, and extraordinary skill earned admiration wherever he traveled. Many believed there had never been another knight quite like him, and in many ways they were right. The lady had prepared him well. Watching from the quiet places where history rarely looks, she could see the child she had raised becoming exactly the man she had hoped he would become. There is a quiet satisfaction in such moments. Every teacher hopes to witness a student surpass expectations. Every gardener smiles when long-tended seeds finally bloom. Every parent discovers that one day the child no longer needs guiding hands. yet carries those early lessons into every choice they make. The lake remembers fulfillment. It is one of the gentlest emotions. It asks for nothing more than gratitude. Yet even during these peaceful years, the oldest storytellers remind us that every kingdom carries within it the seeds of future change. Human hearts remain wonderfully capable of courage and kindness, but they are also vulnerable to misunderstanding, pride, longing, and sorrow. No amount of wisdom can entirely remove those qualities because they are simply part of being human. Perhaps that is why Arthur's story continues to feel so familiar after so many centuries. It is not a tale about perfect people. It is a story about good people trying to do what is right while carrying the same hopes, fears, and imperfections that belong to every generation. The lake remembers human hearts. They are seldom simple. Like the water itself, they may appear perfectly calm while quiet currents move beneath the surface. Soon those hidden currents will begin to shape the destiny of Camelot. Not through one sudden disaster, not through a single unwise decision, but through many small choices, each understandable on its own, gradually flowing together like tiny streams that eventually become a mighty river. The lady watches without judgment. She understands something that only time can teach. Every season has its purpose. Every story has its evening. And every gift, no matter how precious, is one day returned to the place from which it first came. The lake remembers that promise. Soon, it will ask for Excalibur once again. The lake remembers the final journey. The years had carried Arthur farther than the young king who once stood beside these same waters could ever have imagined. His hair had silvered. The burdens of leadership had left their quiet mark upon his face. He had known great victories, lasting friendships, heartbreaking losses, and the difficult truth that even the noblest kingdom cannot remain untouched by time. Camelot had become a beacon of hope. Yet hope, like every season, changes with the passing years. The round table had begun to grow smaller. Familiar voices were missing from its halls. Empty chairs quietly reminded those who remained that every generation must eventually say farewell to the one before it. The lake remembers every farewell. Some come gently. Others arrive before anyone feels ready. The legends tell us that Arthur rode to his final battle knowing the kingdom he loved would never be quite the same again. He did not ride out seeking glory. Those days belonged to his youth. Instead, he carried the quiet determination of a ruler willing to protect his people for as long as strength remained. When the battle had ended, the cost was greater than anyone had imagined. The fields had grown still. The voices of kings and knights had faded into silence. Arthur himself had been gravely wounded, and only a handful of loyal companions remained beside him. Among them was Bedivere. The faithful knight had traveled with Arthur through years of triumph and hardship. Now he stood beside his wounded king beneath a sky that seemed strangely peaceful after so much sorrow. The noise of battle had disappeared, leaving only the wind moving softly across the land. Arthur looked toward the familiar, sword resting beside him. Excalibur had served its purpose. Its story had always been connected to the lake. Now, as the day quietly drew toward its close, the promise made so many years before had come full circle. "Take the sword," Arthur said gently. "Return it to the water." Bedivere looked down at the magnificent blade. It seemed impossible that something so beautiful should simply disappear beneath the lake. Yet the water had been waiting patiently all along. Bedivere carried Excalibur toward the quiet lake. The path seemed strangely familiar, though he could not have explained why. Ancient trees stood watch along the shoreline, their branches reaching gently over the still water. A light mist drifted across the surface, softening the distant shore until lake and sky appeared to blend together. The lake remembers every promise. Bedivere paused at the water's edge and looked down at the sword. The jeweled hilt caught the fading light. The polished blade reflected the peaceful sky above. Never had human hands crafted a weapon of greater beauty. It seemed impossible that such a treasure should simply vanish beneath quiet water, unseen by future generations. His heart hesitated. Instead of obeying Arthur's command, Bedivere carried the sword away and concealed it among the trees. Returning to the wounded king, he quietly said that the task had been done and that nothing remarkable had happened when the sword touched the water. Arthur listened without anger. He had spent a lifetime reading the hearts of those around him. Bedivere's words were calm, but they carried the weight of hesitation rather than truth. "Friend," Arthur said softly, "go once more." There was no accusation in his voice, only quiet certainty. Bedivere returned to the lakeshore. Again he lifted the sword. Again he admired the flawless workmanship, the jeweled hilt, the perfect balance that had defended a kingdom through so many difficult years. He wondered whether future generations might preserve such a treasure, remembering Arthur through the sword he had carried. Once more, he could not let it go. The lake remained perfectly still. It did not demand. It simply waited. When Bedivere returned a second time, Arthur knew the promise had still not been fulfilled. The old king understood something that his faithful knight had not yet accepted. Excalibur had never truly belonged to Arthur. It had been entrusted to him. Every gift has its season. Every trust carries its own responsibility. The sword had come from the lake. Now it was time for it to return. For the third time, Bedivere walked alone toward the waiting shore. This time he did not linger. With one smooth motion, he lifted Excalibur high into the quiet evening air and cast it far across the still water. For a single breath, the sword seemed to hang between sky and lake. Then the surface opened. A graceful arm, clothed in shimmering fabric, rose from the depths exactly as it had so many years before. The hand caught the sword effortlessly, lifting it high for just a moment as the jeweled hilt caught the last light of day. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, the hand sank beneath the water. The ripples spread gently across the lake. They widened. They softened. At last, the surface became perfectly still once more. The promise had been kept. The lake remembered, and the sword had come home. When Bedivere returned, Arthur needed no explanation. He saw the quiet peace in his faithful knight's face and understood that the promise had been fulfilled. The sword had returned to the place from which it first emerged, and with it, the final duty of his reign had quietly come to an end. The lake remembers fulfilled promises. Evening settled gently across the landscape. The distant sounds of the battlefield had faded, leaving only the whisper of wind through the reeds and the soft movement of water against the shore. For the first time in many years, there was nothing left for Arthur to command, no kingdom left to defend, and no burden left to carry. Then, through the drifting mist, a dark barge appeared. It moved without hurry across the still water, its oars making scarcely a sound. Upon it stood several noble women dressed in flowing robes, their faces touched with both sorrow and compassion. Medieval storytellers gave them different names, yet they all agreed that they had come for Arthur alone. Among them was the lady. Whether she stood at the oar, waited silently beneath a dark cloak, or remained almost hidden among the others depended upon the storyteller. It hardly mattered. Her presence could be felt as naturally as the lake itself. The lake remembers every homecoming. Bedivere helped the wounded king into the waiting boat. Arthur looked once more toward the shores of Britain. The forests, the distant hills, and the quiet water had shaped every chapter of his life. He had arrived as a young king filled with hope. Now he departed as an old one, carrying gratitude rather than regret. The barge slowly drifted away from the shore. Mist gathered around it until the outlines of the women softened into pale silhouettes. The gentle rhythm of the oars became quieter with every passing moment, while Avalon seemed less like a distant island than a place slowly revealing itself to those invited to enter. The lake remembers Avalon, not as an ending, as a place where stories are gently laid to rest until they are needed once again. Bedivere remained on the shore, watching until the boat disappeared completely into the silver mist. At last there was only still water before him, reflecting the evening sky exactly as it had on the day Arthur first received Excalibur. The lake had witnessed the beginning. Now it had witnessed the return. Its oldest promise was complete. For centuries, people have wondered what became of Arthur. Some believed he died upon the shores of Avalon, his long journey finally complete after a lifetime of service. Others believed he merely rested there, waiting until Britain should one day have need of him again. The old legends never ask us to choose between these possibilities. They simply invite us to linger beside the water and allow a little mystery to remain. The lake remembers mysteries. Not every question longs for an answer. Some become more meaningful because they continue echoing through the generations, inviting each listener to imagine the story for themselves. Perhaps that is the greatest gift the Lady of the Lake leaves behind. She is never fully explained. She appears when wisdom is needed. She protects what must be protected. She teaches those willing to learn. She entrusts great gifts to worthy hands, and when their purpose has been fulfilled, she quietly welcomes them home again. Like the lake itself, she asks for nothing. She simply remains. The oldest Arthurian legends have been told for nearly 1,000 years. During that time, kingdoms have risen and fallen. Languages have changed. Castles have become ruins. Forests have grown where busy roads once carried travelers. Yet the lady continues to emerge from quiet water whenever another storyteller begins the tale. The lake remembers every telling. Each generation notices something a little different. Some remember the shining sword. Some remember Merlin. Others remember Lancelot as a child walking through peaceful gardens beneath enchanted skies. Perhaps you will remember the lake, the still water that waited patiently through every chapter. The quiet place where promises began and promises were fulfilled. The silent witness to friendship, courage, love, loss, and hope. Perhaps that is why the legend has never faded. It reminds us that while kingdoms may pass and even the greatest heroes eventually complete their journeys, kindness, wisdom, and faithful stewardship leave ripples that continue long after we are gone. The lake remembers those ripples, and perhaps in its own quiet way, it remembers us as well. There are lakes that seem older than the hills that surround them. Long after kingdoms have disappeared, after castles have become weathered stone, and after the names of kings have faded into history, the water remains. Morning mist still drifts across its surface. Birds still greet the dawn. Gentle ripples still carry the reflections of passing clouds toward distant shores. The lake remembers. It remembers Merlin, walking beneath ancient trees in search of wisdom. It remembers a curious young woman whose quiet heart and eager mind would one day become part of the legend itself. It remembers a young king receiving a sword that was never truly his to keep. It remembers a frightened child who found safety and kindness beneath its timeless protection. It remembers faithful friends, noble promises, seasons of peace, and seasons of sorrow. It remembers a king returning what had always belonged to the water. Perhaps that is why the Lady of the Lake has never truly belonged to one story. She belongs wherever people pause beside quiet water and wonder what memories peaceful places might still be keeping. She reminds us that wisdom is often quiet, that kindness may shape history more deeply than power, and that the greatest guardians rarely ask to be remembered themselves. The lake remembers all of these things, not because it cannot let them go, but because remembering is what sacred places have always done. Perhaps somewhere on a misty morning, there is still a quiet lake where the water is perfectly calm, where the reeds sway gently in the breeze, and where the surface reflects the sky so completely that it becomes impossible to tell where one world ends and another begins. If you were to stand there for a little while, saying nothing at all, you might begin to understand why these stories have endured for so many centuries. Not because they answer every mystery, because they leave room for wonder. Thank you for spending part of your evening with the Sleepy Legends channel. If tonight's journey beside the Lady of the Lake brought you a little peace, you'll find many more quiet legends, myths, and forgotten histories waiting for you here whenever you need a restful escape. If you haven't already, we'd love to have you join our community by subscribing. And if you'd like, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening tonight. I always enjoy seeing how these ancient stories bring together listeners from every corner of the world. Until our next journey together, may your dreams be filled with quiet waters, ancient forests, forgotten castles, gentle moonlight, and timeless legends. From all of us here at the Sleepy Legends channel, good night. Sleep well. The lake remembers.